one thing to notice when you're looking at Egyptian history is that you go to different books, different scholars, and the picture is not always the same. And here's one scholar that makes a very good point here. Here's a statement from a very well-known Egyptologist, Sir Alan Gardner. As you can see, he's very well qualified. And this is what he had to say. It must never be forgotten that we're dealing with a civilization thousands of years old, and one of which only tiny remnants have survived. What is proudly advertised as Egyptian history is merely a collection of rags and tatters. And that's a good point to note. When people try to take Egyptian culture and history and try to fit it into the Bible, you're dealing with something that we're only seeing glimpses of, if you know what I mean. Most of the Egyptian history has been lost, and we've only got little bits to go on. So there's always a little bit of a danger when you try to connect Egyptian history with Bible history. But I'd like to share some things, and again, you can decide on this, just how well things do tie up. Now, for years, scholars have said the Bible must be made up, because when you go to Egyptian history, you don't find the Exodus story found in the Bible. You don't find it in Egypt, at least Egyptian history as it's been recorded by the Egyptians. And because of that, here's a typical statement that some of the scholars make. This gentleman here, Philip Davies, is a professor of biblical studies at the University of Sheffield, and he said this. He said the society that was created in the Bible and their history was an imaginary one, a fictional one. I don't believe in the reality of 3.5 million people wandering across the Sinai Desert for 40 years. I don't believe in the crossing of the Red Sea with the water standing up. And this is the view of many scholars today, particularly in academic circles and university. They essentially say, we don't believe the Bible. It's imaginary. As he says here, it's a fictional one, an imaginary one. And what I'll put to you, if you look in the right place and think carefully about what you'd expect to find, you do find bits of evidence, even in Egyptian history, about the Exodus story. And we'll look at some of those tonight and see if we can join some of the dots. So we're going to go to the land of the pyramids again, just briefly. One thing to note is the inscriptions and the monuments they built weren't there to record the daily news. A lot of these monuments there were to make the Pharaoh look like a god, because essentially Egyptians believed the Pharaoh was a god on earth. And most of these monuments were built to extol the virtues of the Pharaoh. Do you follow that? It's sort of to make him look like a hero, and therefore he deserved to be the king of Egypt. And so what you find recorded here is not always entirely accurate history. In fact, there's accounts on some of these, like a particular Pharaoh conquering the Hittites and winning many victories. But when you go to the Hittite records, you actually find out that the Pharaoh lost some of these battles. So you've got to be careful. You have to compare one group of records with another, and you find they don't always match up. Now, if we go back to the story of the Exodus, when Moses went to meet Pharaoh, you remember the story how Pharaoh refused to let God's people go? And so God sent the plagues. Do you remember that? Here's a little picture of the stars being turned to snakes. Do you remember that? We're dealing with a real battle here between truth and error. And God sent the plagues. Remember, here's the list of the 10 plagues that God sent. Now, these were devastating. If you go through the plagues and look at them, they absolutely devastated Egypt. Like the locusts, it says, basically consumed everything that was living on the ground. You had hail mingled with fire. You had the cattle getting diseases. And of course, the last one, all the firstborn were slain. These plagues devastated Egypt. Now, you think you'd find some record somewhere of this event, and you do, not on the stone monuments, but in the papyrus records. Now, the papyrus was built from this plant that used to grow in the Nile. It's not in Egypt anymore. That's an interesting Bible prophecy, that papyrus would cease from the land of Egypt. But back in the time of the Exodus, they used to use papyrus for records. You can go to Egypt today and see how they, even today, for the tourists, they make up papyrus sheets by taking strips of the papyrus plant, and they roll it out and weave it together, make paper. And I'd like to share with you a papyrus that's found in Holland, in the Leiden Museum there, Leiden, Netherlands, the Dutch Museum of Antiquities. There's the papyrus called the Ipuwer papyrus. Has anyone heard of the Ipuwer papyrus? Maybe not. Well, when you look at the translation of this, it's very interesting when you compare what the Bible had to say about the Exodus. First of all, let's look at some Bible verses that described what was going on in Egypt at the time, and you compare that with what this papyrus reported. It's quite interesting. Remember in Exodus chapter 7, it talked about how Moses lifted up his rod and smote the waters, and all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. And it said the Egyptians digged round about the river for water to drink because they couldn't drink the river water. Now this papyrus, which you can see in the museum in Holland, talks about pestilences throughout the land, blood is everywhere, and it goes on to say the river, which is the Nile, is blood. Men shrink and thirst after water. Now that's interesting. Someone might say, well, that's a coincidence. And some scholars try to write these off as, well, it's just a coincidence, or maybe there was a flood and the water got discoloured. But some of the details you'll see as we go on are very specific. The Bible talked about a plague upon the cattle, the horses, the asses, the camels, the oxen, and the sheep, a very grievous plague. This papyrus talked about all animals, their hearts weep, cattle moan. So something was happening with the cattle when this papyrus is recorded. Now here's a very interesting one. The Bible talks about hail coming down, and it says fire ran along upon the ground. Very intriguing. That's not normal hail, is it? And it says, so there was hail and fire mingled with the hail, very grievous. Now it's obviously not normal hail that we see today, is it? But have a look at what this papyrus recorded. Very intriguing. It says the fire ran along the ground. There was hail and fire mingled with the hail. Very intriguing. That's almost a direct quote from the Bible. And this is from an Egyptian record that has nothing to do with the Bible. And it goes on here to talk about how columns and walls are consumed by fire. Interesting. It talked about the plague of locusts in the Bible. They covered the whole face of the earth, so the land was darkened. And they ate every herb and all the fruit. And it says, there remained not any green thing in the trees. So these locusts just stripped everything bare. This papyrus talked about no fruit nor herbs are found. It talks about trees are destroyed and the branches are stripped off. And it mentions a noise. It says, oh, that the earth would cease from noise and tumult. Uproar be no more. That maybe was the beating of the wings, these clouds and clouds of locusts. The Bible talked about a thick darkness in the land for 3 days. And it's interesting, this papyrus records something very similar. It says, the land is without light. Then, of course, the last plague, the most devastating of all. It talks about all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. Of course, except where they put the blood on the doorposts, as you may recall. And what happened? This struck Egypt very severely. Even Pharaoh, his firstborn died. It says, Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. Every family in Egypt had been afflicted by this plague. And this papyrus seems to report the same event. It says, he who places his brother in the ground is everywhere. Groanings throughout the land mingled with lamentations. Forsooth, the children of princes are dashed against the walls. The children of princes are cast out in the streets. That seems to be a reference to the same thing. And then what happened when Pharaoh finally said, go, leave the land? You remember what the Hebrews did? They'd been slaves for many years. And they went and collected their pay, so to speak. And it says, they requested from the Egyptians silver and gold items and clothing. And the Lord gave the people favour in the sight of the Egyptians. And they gave them whatever they wanted. So they plundered Egypt. It's interesting to see what this papyrus says. It says, the plunderer is everywhere. And the servant takes what he finds. Indeed, poor men have become wealthy. Gold, silver, and jewels are fastened to the necks of female slaves. Slaves who have now been freed are throughout the land. The king's storehouse has now become common property. This sounds very much like the same sort of thing going on here. What was very important, though, of course, is what was happening during the time of the plagues, when there was darkness in the land of Egypt, people are being afflicted with sores and so forth. What was God doing for his people? Do you remember that there were swarms of flies at one time? It says, the house of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground whereupon they are. And I will sever in that day the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, so that no swarms of flies shall be there. God was protecting his people. What about the plague upon the cattle? It says, and all the cattle of Egypt died, but of the cattle of the children of Israel died not one. God was protecting his people, wasn't he, from these plagues? What about this one? The magicians couldn't stand before Moses because of the boils. They had boils and these sores all over them. The boil was upon the magicians and upon all the Egyptians, but not upon God's people. What about the hail that smote throughout all the land of Egypt? Only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were, was there no hail. Once again, God preserved his people during the time of these plagues. And what about when darkness covered the land of Egypt? Moses stretched forth his hand toward heaven, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. They saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days. But, and all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. Interesting. And of course, that wonderful salvation, if you like, when they were told to put blood on the doorposts, God preserved his people during that time. And finally, when the Hebrews left, and Pharaoh said, go, get out of the land, lest we all be dead men. As they left, it says, against any of the children of Israel shall not a dog move his tongue against man or beast, that ye may know that the Lord doth put a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. Now, this is very significant because the Bible talks about, and we may get a chance later in the series to look at some of that if we get time, it talks about the 7 last plagues. Have you read that in the book of Revelation? And once again, God is going to preserve his people during that time. And so what we want to seek to do is become part of God's people in that day, when once again he's going to put a difference between those who receive the mark of the beast and receive the plagues, and those who receive the seal of God. In fact, it talks about this in Psalms 91. Here's a wonderful promise for the future. It talks about, thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor the arrow that flieth by day, nor for the pestilence that walketh in darkness, nor for the destruction that wasteth at noonday. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. A wonderful promise here in verse 10. There shall no evil befall thee, neither shall any plague come nigh thy dwelling. And what's the reason? Because in verse 9, because thou hast made the Lord, which is my refuge, even the Most High, thy habitation. So people that trust in God in this time that's coming up, spoken of in the book of Revelation, will be safe from those 7 last plagues the Bible talks about. Now, getting back to Egyptian history again, when did the events of the Exodus occur? Can we work out the timing of this? And the answer is yes, if we look in the right place. I've got a little video clip coming up again. This is about 6 minutes long again. And this asks the question, who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Who was the Pharaoh at the time when Moses came down? Who did Moses speak to when he said, let my people go? And this video starts to join some of the dots. And after the video, we've got some more very interesting dots we can join.
While a body of archaeological evidence supports the historical validity of the Exodus, speculation still surrounds the true identity of the Pharaoh responsible for the Hebrews' bondage and flight from Egypt. Not surprisingly, there are no helpful clues in Egypt's often self-serving historical records. Nor is the Pharaoh of the Exodus mentioned by name anywhere in the Old Testament accounts. However, Despite the lack of direct evidence, scholars continue their attempts to define the key personalities of the Exodus narrative. And during the past century, two conflicting theories have emerged. They are based on what is now known as the early and late dates of the Exodus. Supporters of the late chronology usually identify Ramesses the Great as the Pharaoh who enslaved Israel. The basis for this theory is found in the Old Testament.
So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses.
Although there were several Egyptian kings named Ramesses, Ramesses II is most often tied to the accounts of the Israelites' bondage. The reasons are obvious. At the time of Ramesses' birth, in roughly 1304 BC, the period now called the 19th dynasty, Egypt was at the peak of her glory. Ramesses ascended the throne in 1290 BC with a vision to expand his nation's borders. He decided to move his capital from the ancient city of Thebes to the northeastern Nile Delta. There he built a new royal city and called it Pi-Ramesses. Some historians have reasoned that because the name Pi-Ramesses was similar to the city identified in the Old Testament, Ramesses II must have been the pharaoh who enslaved the Hebrews as his workforce. Yet recent archaeological discoveries now reveal that Ramesses II may have actually built his capital and renamed it in his honor on the foundations of a city that had been constructed by Israelite hands at least 300 years earlier. Centuries later, ancient scribes who copied the first written documents of the Exodus account probably used Pi-Ramesses, the newer, more familiar name of the city, in their transcriptions. But if popular interpretations, including Cecil B. DeMille's epic film, depicting Ramesses as pharaoh of the Exodus are incorrect, then which Egyptian ruler actually confronted Moses and his God? Many believe the answer is linked directly to another Old Testament passage.
Now it came about in the 480th year, after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, that he began to build the house of the Lord.
Most historians agree that Solomon commenced building the temple in Jerusalem in 965 BC. According to the scriptures, this construction began 480 years after the Exodus. That means the biblical date of Israel's departure from Egypt is approximately 1445 BC, more than a century before Ramses II was born. This early date for the Exodus, 1445 BC, is supported by numerous archaeological discoveries. And if it is accurate, an intriguing scenario involving Moses and some of Egypt's most illustrious rulers takes shape. 1445 BC would mean the Exodus occurred in the middle of Egypt's 18th dynasty. This was a period when the great shrines of Karnak, Luxor, and Deir el-Bahari rose majestically near the banks of the Nile. Within this chronology, Moses would have been born during the reign of Thutmose I, a warrior king who helped make Egypt an imperial power. Thutmose had a daughter named Hatshepsut. Some scholars have speculated she could have rescued the infant Moses from the Nile and raised him as her son. The very name Moses is of Egyptian derivation. Early in the 15th century BC, Hatshepsut, now herself ruler of Egypt, was locked in a vicious battle for power with her stepson, Thutmose III. Thutmose ultimately took control of the empire and erased the images of Hatshepsut from the monuments she had erected. His hatred for Hatshepsut was perhaps intensified by knowledge she had rescued and raised Moses with the hope he would one day succeed her as pharaoh. Thutmose III was a ruthless conqueror and may well have been pharaoh during the peak of the Israelites' oppression. Some scholars have speculated that he also pursued the Israelites into the Red Sea, for the length of Thutmose's reign and the date of his death coincide almost perfectly with the early biblical chronology. Was Thutmoses III the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Today, a scarcity of direct archaeological evidence and confusion over precise dating make it difficult to conclusively identify the Egyptian rulers who shaped the destiny of Moses and his people. Yet while these chapters of antiquity may never be completely defined, one thing is certain. The glory of Egypt's pharaohs has long faded into the desert sands. But accounts of Moses and his faith still endure and inspire after 3,500 years.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that. A little bit of an overview. And that little clip brought out some very, very good points. For example, you might have seen that the Bible actually gives a date for the time of the Exodus, counting back from the 4th year of Solomon's reign. Here's the verse, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. The 4th year of Solomon's reign, and that the year that he began to build the house of the Lord, was the 480th year after the children of Israel will come out of the land of Egypt. And we know we're on solid ground if we go on what the Bible says. Now, my friend Leonard, who's written a nice book about this, you can actually buy this from Amazon or Koorong bookshops in Australia. He's done a lot of research. And actually, this is a fascinating thing, by the way. This inscription here, it's called the Joseph Stone. It's in the Nile. It's on an island in the Nile River. And it describes, it's actually written by the priests of Egypt many years after the time of Joseph. And it's saying we should not have to pay tax because in the time of the 7 years famine, Pharaoh Joseph exempted us from tax. And if you look up the Bible story of the story of Joseph, that's almost a direct quote from that. Very interesting. It's called the Joseph Stone. And this is Leonard, myself, and Noah's Ark. We'll talk about that site next week. But in his book, he has a very nice little chart which shows this. Scholars believe around about 966, 965 BC was when they began to build the temple. Solomon began to reign about 970. So you count back 480 years and it takes you to around about 1446, 1445 BC. And that takes you to the time in the Egyptian dynasties where you had Hatshepsut, and that fits very nicely that she was the daughter of the Pharaoh and she adopted Moses. And if you fit biblical chronology in here, Moses spent 40 years in the land of Midian, and work out who was Pharaoh when he came back 40 years later, we come to a very interesting period in Egyptian history. Now, the Egyptians had a system of co-regency. You had Pharaoh ruling on the throne at Thebes, and his eldest son, or the crown prince, if you like, ruled in Memphis. And the titles would change. When they were crown prince, they were given one name, and when they became the Pharaoh, they received another name. It's a little bit like you can think about the system we have in the New Zealand monarchy system. You have Prince Charles, who's the Prince of Wales. You've probably heard of that. But one day, his title will change from Prince of Wales into, what? The King of England. Do you understand? His title will change, although it's the same person. And apparently, the Egyptians did the same thing. Crown Prince Thutmoses IV became Amenhotep III, and his son was Tutankhamun. Now again, different scholars have different ideas. Sometimes they swap these people around, so this is not necessarily in concrete, but this is one way that the dots join very, very nicely. For example, Thutmoses IV changed his name. His title became Amenhotep III when he became Pharaoh. Now, if you go to the Sphinx, between the legs of the Sphinx is this enormous stone stele, and there's an inscription on here written by Thutmoses IV. And he claims on this stone that one day he was sleeping by the Sphinx, and the Sphinx spoke to him in a dream. And the Sphinx said to him, "If you clear the sand away from me, I will make you Pharaoh." And obviously he became the Pharaoh later. And you've got to ask, why would Thutmoses IV create this stele with this story, this account of the Sphinx giving him a dream, giving him a title to become the Pharaoh, if he had it by right. And the thinking goes this way. He's created this story to justify his ascension to the throne because he may not have had it by birthright. Which means, if you think this through, he was not the firstborn. He had to have another claim to become the title, to become the Pharaoh. And that makes sense because you think about when all the firstborn were slain in the land of Egypt, the Pharaoh, who in theory should have been the firstborn son, he did not die. Does that make sense? If he was the firstborn, then the Pharaoh would have died as well. But this would explain that because in theory he wasn't the firstborn. He had to have another claim to the throne. Now this is his son, Tutankhamun, probably very familiar with him, a very well-known discovery because his tomb was discovered undisturbed. It hadn't been robbed when it was discovered in 1922, and everybody's familiar with this death mask that was found on the mummy of Tutankhamun. A very elaborate funeral. Here's the coffin. They had coffins within coffins, and some of the items that were discovered in his tomb are quite amazing. If you ever get to Egypt and go to the Cairo Museum, you'll see all these things. Because in their thinking, when somebody died and they wanted to take these items into the next life, it had to be buried with them. So this is all his earthly treasure that he was going to take with him into the next life, had to be put in the tomb with him. And so his tomb was full of interesting items. Of course, they had the chariots there, which were very helpful in thinking about the Exodus, but many other items. Little model boat here, chests and things, there's his bed, and you can go and see this in the Cairo Museum. Lots of different items. A lot of it was gold. There's another bed or couch that he had. Here's his throne. There's another shot of his throne there with Tutankhamun and his wife there. Second gold coffin, all made of gold, quite remarkable. And inside that was another coffin made of solid gold. And if you look in the Cairo Museum today, you'll see these gold items they used to wear, these little handcuffs. Here's some more items. A gold dagger, and this was an iron dagger, cast iron. That was very valuable because iron was very hard to make. So that was looked after. There's his jandals, if you like, made of gold. And the little caps they put on his fingers. This is Tutankhamun himself. He's looking a little bit older there. He's a few thousand years old now. And people often wondered, he's actually quite young, how did he die? What caused Tutankhamun's death? And for years people have speculated on that. They did some x-rays many years ago, and these are the actual x-rays here. And when they did these x-rays, they noticed a fragment of bone here. And they thought, aha, this could be how he was killed. Somebody clubbed him on the back of the head one night when he was sleeping on his bed. You might have heard this theory. Came in with a club and hit him hard on the back of his head and killed him that way. And that piece of bone that showed up in the x-ray, there it is there, they speculated may have been a bone fragment that came off the back of his skull when he was clubbed. And that was a popular theory for many years. In fact, books were written about this. Here's one called The Murder of Tutankhamun, a 3,000-year-old murder mystery. And here's an interesting quote from this book. A bone fragment is clearly visible inside Tutankhamun's skull. Could this fragment have been the effect of a violent blow struck at the pharaoh's head with an evil intent, a blow that killed Tutankhamun? That's what they speculated for a long time. He went on to say this, though. If there was a significant hematoma, that's like a big blood clot from when the blow was struck, that remained for some time after the injury, this might be detectable with a high-powered CAT scan. If and when the mummy of Tutankhamun is examined again, this should rank high on the list of procedures to be performed. Well, you know, that was done. They did a CAT scan. Here's the BBC News report about this. It was done in 2005. They put Tutankhamun in the CT scanner and they scanned him. And one thing they found from this, they found no evidence of a blow on the back of the head. Here's what they said. A CT scan of his remains in 2005 led researchers to say that he was not murdered and may have died of complications from a broken leg, something quite different. So after this CAT scan, They still didn't fully understand what he died of, but it says, all rejected the long-standing murder charge. Not all of them agreed. They still didn't understand what was going on here, but they could see clearly he did not die from a blow on the back of the head. They suggested maybe he died from an infection from a broken leg. That was one suggestion that came out of this. Others suggested maybe that leg was broken when Howard Carter pulled him out of the coffin, because apparently he was glued in there with resin. So maybe the broken leg came from that. Do you know, here's a report from the New Zealand Herald a couple of years ago. And guess what the theory is now? King Tut died of malaria. In other words, they don't know. They keep putting forward all these different theories, which as they do more investigation, they discover, okay, that's not the reason. What I'm going to suggest to you is something quite radical, but it fits. We're just going to join some dots here, and again, if you don't accept this, that's fine. There's no pressure on this, but I'll share some very interesting tie-ups. This is Tutankhamun here, and National Geographic reconstructed what he looked like. I don't know if you saw this a couple of years ago, where they modelled what he probably looked like. He was quite young, very young. Now, I'd like to share something with you very interesting. If you want to join the dots, I'm going to share something that doesn't come from Egypt, but comes from Turkey. This tablet here, this is a Hittite tablet, which you can go and see today in the Archaeology Museum in Istanbul. It's on display there. And this dates back to, notice the dating here, about the time of the Exodus, according to the Bible. The Hittites, by the way, covered this area here in Turkey. This is Egypt down here. This is where the pharaohs lived. But the Hittites were a growing power. They were rising into power. And this tablet is a Hittite tablet recording the deeds of one of the kings of the Hittites. It's the deeds of King Suppiluliuma I. And this is the archives, the records, if you like, the chronicles, written by his son. And this is a translation. You can see here, it's a bit hard to read, so here it is enlarged here. This is the translation they've got in the museum right by this tablet. And this is what King Suppiluliuma's son wrote about what was happening with his father, the king. And this is how it translates. It says, because their lord, Nibhururiya, and that is Tutankhamun. They know that. The translators know that this is Tutankhamun. So because Tutankhamun had just died, the Egyptian queen, who had become a widow, sent an envoy to my father and wrote him as follows. So this is Tut's widow, his wife, who's now a widow, writing to the king of the Hittites. And she says this, my husband died and I have no son. People say that you have many sons. If you were to send me one of your sons, he would become my husband. Never shall I pick out a servant of mine and make him my husband. I am afraid. Now this is intriguing, because when the Hittites got this letter from the Egyptian queen, they thought, wow, this is totally this isn't normal, because the Egyptians were seen as the world superpower. This was amazing. This would be like, if you want an equivalent today, imagine if Parliament in Wellington got a letter from the Congress in the United States saying, President Obama has just died. Please send us one of your MPs and he'll become President of the United States. That's what it would be the equivalent of. And you can read here in the tablet, it goes on to say, when my father heard that, he called the great council and said, since the most ancient times, such a thing has never happened before. It seems so out of the ordinary for the Hittites. He proceeded to dispatch Hattusili the chamberlain, saying, go, bring you reliable information back to me. They may try to deceive me. As to the possibility they may have a prince, bring me back information worthy of belief. In other words, this king thought, this is a bit suspicious here. Why would the world superpower want to have one of my sons to become king of their land? It doesn't make sense. And the tablet goes on to say this. The queen of Egypt wrote back to my father in a letter thus, why do you say they deceive me in that way? If I had a son, would I write to a foreign country in a manner which is humiliating to me in my country? Give me one of your sons, and he is my husband and king in the land of Egypt. pretty radical, isn't it? And so what happened? The Hittite king finally sent a son down there. Because my father was kind-hearted, he complied with the lady's wishes and decided for sending his son. And the tablet in the museum, the little plaque in the museum, not the tablet, but the plaque next to it, says, from another text, we know that the Hittite prince never reached Egypt, but was murdered along the way. Something was going on in Egypt at this time. There was a power struggle going on. Can you see this? Now, if you think this through, why on earth would Tutankhamun's wife write to a foreign power asking for a son to be sent to Egypt for her to marry to become king of Egypt? This only makes sense in light of the Exodus. Does that make sense? You think about it. Egypt's been devastated. What happened to the army of Egypt? All drowned in the Red Sea. They're gone. The king, the Pharaoh, is gone. The crown prince, Tutankhamun, who was going to be the next king, has just died as their firstborn in the plague. So here's this poor little widow saying, what are we going to do? As soon as the nations round about us hear what's gone on, we're going to be invaded. People are going to come in and strip Egypt bare. And they thought, I know. We'll form an alliance with the next world's most powerful country, the Hittites. If the king of the Hittites sends one of his sons down here, marries me, and if anybody dares attack us, guess who's going to come and help his son? Daddy will come down and help. Do you get the picture? That's the only way this makes any sense. It fits right into the Exodus. Now, of course, we know from the Bible how the Hebrews were saved by putting blood on the doorposts, and God initiated this or brought this in as what's called the Passover ceremony. You remember that? The Jews commemorated this every year, and you find this here in Leviticus 23. These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations, which ye shall proclaim in their seasons. In the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. And they commemorated this every year. Even today, the Jews celebrate the Passover. And the Passover was the 14th day of the first month, like a calendar date, except one difference with the Hebrew calendar, it's based on a lunar cycle. Did you know that? They began their year on the sighting of a new moon. And so the 14th day of the first month would vary. In fact, here's a little chart. Oh, by the way, did you know that every Passover is always a full moon? It's a full moon ceremony. Here's a little chart showing dates for the Passover over different years. Like in 2006, it was the 13th of April. 2007, it was the 3rd of April. And so you have different dates when the Passover is celebrated. And here's little markers showing where they are. And it's always, because it's a lunar cycle, and the lunar month is about 29 and something days long, the Passover always occurs between mid-March and late April. It's always in that period. Do you follow that? The Passover, the 14th day of the first month, is always within this period, because the Jewish year, started at different times depending on the cycle of the moon. Now, it's intriguing. If you go back to Tutankhamun's grave, his tomb, they found in his tomb this here. It's a floral collar, like someone would wear around their neck, made of flowers. And it's intriguing. If you look on the Luxor government website here, where it describes this is off the Egyptian government website, it says this: by examining the floral wreaths, they were able to establish the burial season of the sovereign between, and notice this, mid-March and late April. And how did they know that? It says because botanists recognized cornflowers, bittersweets, and mandrakes which blossomed during that period. So in other words, based on the type of flowers here, they could tell, we know what time of year Tutankhamun died. And they state it was between mid-March and late April. How intriguing. When does the Passover occur? Between mid-March and late April. Tutankhamun died, and I'm not saying this is proof, but it's another dot that joins, if you follow what I mean, that Tutankhamun died at the same time of the year that the Jews today celebrate the Passover. It's not proof, but it's just another little dot that joins up that suggests strongly Tutankhamun could well have been the firstborn of the Pharaoh who died in that 10th plague, and then his father drowned in the Red Sea, chasing the Hebrews. Something intriguing to continue studying. And when he was buried, all the things that were buried with him were there for